I'll try to get into a little bit more of the motivation for looking at supply chain network structure, and particularly how risk propagates through the supply chain. And I think it's something that's been particularly relevant going through this COVID period, where we've seen supply chains having an impact across the globe, whether it's supply chains for vaccine or supply chains for consumer products. But we see the connections around the world and how disturbances that occur in one part of the world lead to issues in other parts of the world. And thinking about how supply chain networks are composed and how those shocks are transmitted through the networks, and how firms are making decisions about constructing these supply chains and how those decisions impact the propagation of the risk. That's what I'm going to focus on in this talk. And I'll try to give you a little bit of some empirical background, a little bit of some theoretical background, and a little bit about what kinds of research issues there are in looking at supply chains from this network perspective. Okay, so that's basically what I'm going to go through. I was told I would have a little bit of a chance to talk about my journal, since you've had other journal editors as part of this series. So I'll give you a little bit of a background, maybe some things that you know about the journal operations research, and then maybe some things you don't know. We've been working on trying to give faster return times, and I'll show you some data about that in a little bit. We also are beginning a process of having fast track papers. Management science has had fast track papers for the last couple of years. We want that in operations research such that we have a group of associate editors who are focused on that. And these would be for papers like papers that are around the COVID pandemic, but papers that have some kind of currency to them, that are addressing current problems or addressing problems in an area that is changing quite rapidly, and how we would put those, or how we can get that research distributed quite quickly. We've also been doing this with some of the conferences, particularly the economics and computation conference, the EC conference, where where papers which are submitted to the conference are routed directly to the journal, and that allows for some faster turnaround times there. We've also had, we have an issue which will be coming out shortly about behavioral issues in queuing. Another issue which just has closed for submissions on electric power systems, and then another which is coming up in reinforcement learning. And we're working to put in more enhancements for papers in terms of videos and comments. This is just showing you by the areas of the journal where the various papers are. What you might get from this is that operations and supply chain has the greatest number of submissions in terms of overall submissions to the journal. We have been increasingly seeing more submissions in the newer area of marketing analytics and revenue management, as well as the area of machine learning and data science. So if you're working in those areas, those are particularly highlighted. And as I said, the turnaround times, particularly it's in this lower chart here on the left, particularly in terms of the time to get a final decision, that is to have the paper accepted or to have the paper ultimately rejected. The time for that decision has gone down somewhat dramatically, where it was beyond a year before, and now it's actually down to something around 9 months. Now that's to go through all stages. So that's all revisions and to get to a final decision. So we're now being able to get through generally 2 revisions, or at least 2 submissions, and including time for authors to work on the papers and get them back in and have it accepted. We're seeing this is, I think, through the last quarter of 2020, but into 2021, we had a fairly large increase in submissions. So in the last quarter or first quarter 2021, submissions have gone up substantially, as you might expect, and acceptance rates overall about the same as they have been. Okay, so that's a little bit about the journal. This other part I wanted to focus on, just because people might have seen like impact factors and looking at what are the impact factors of different journals. For the operations research journal, while the impact factor in terms of this is how many times a paper which has appeared in the last 2 years is cited in the next year. That impact factor has been fairly steady for operations research. But if you look at this in terms of the essentially like the page rank, like the eigenvector centrality of a paper. In other words, look at the impact of the papers which cite the paper that you're citing, and keep on doing that. That article influence has actually been going up, and so operations research has relatively high overall article influence relative to other journals in the area, and that shows that the papers that are being cited by other papers that are being cited, and that's just showing how visible the papers are that appear in operations research. Okay, so that's all I'll have to say about operations research, the journal. Oh, I should say too, if I'm not going to necessarily be able to monitor, I'll try to monitor the chat, but if you have questions, you can post them in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll try to look and see where you are to grab the questions. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? So I'm going to talk about networks. And as I said, they're increasingly important in terms of what the effect of structure is on supply chains. And what we've seen is that supply chains won't actually show this empirical result, but some others have looked at this and found that supply chains are getting longer and longer and more complex. So if you look at how many levels downstream does a supply chain go from, let's say, an average firm? Well, it goes more levels downstream and it goes more levels upstream. So supply chains are getting longer and longer. They're going through more and more different steps, or more and more different hands. And that's creating an ever greater complexity in terms of the organization of supply chains. Within these supply chains, it's important not just to look at the structure, but to think about what each of the agents, each of the individual firms, or each of the individual organizations within a supply chain, what it is that they're basing their decisions on. So looking at the endogenous decisions that they make in terms of forming connections within the network is, I think, a key to really understanding the role that networks play. Without looking at how the networks are formed, we often can come to different conclusions than what happens when we look at how these decisions are being made. And overall, these results imply that there's very different behavior, and you can see different effects depending on where firms are in a supply chain. So the further downstream a firm is, or the further upstream a firm is, may have a difference in terms of their impact on the overall supply chain and the overall global supply chain, the overall network of firms, as well as their influence from the overall network of firms. And it depends on what role they're playing. So where they are within the supply chain and what role they're playing, whether they're manufacturing or whether they're distributing, is going to have an effect, or has an effect, on the influence that they have on the overall supply chain, as well as how they are themselves impacted by the overall supply chain. And I'll try to explain a little bit about that and show you some empirical results and show you some data that will give you some impression about what these impacts are. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about these empirical observations, and then I'll talk about some ideas for how supply chains are formed and the equilibrium characterization of the decisions within those supply chains. And then I'll talk about cascades. I'm not going to get too much into that. As I said, I have some additional work with Punctuo Chen and Agostino Caponi that talks about this in sort of more detail in terms of stylized models, but I'll talk a little bit about the impact of cascades, and in particular, I'll apply it to some financial networks to show you the impact of considering endogenous decisions versus considering a fixed network structure. Okay, so we all know about networks. They're all over the world. This is something like the Facebook graph. So some networks are social, some are about how people communicate with other people and how people are linked across the world through those types of connections. They also relate, of course, to biology. These are like molecular interactions for proteomics. They also relate to physical networks like the electric power network, which in addition to obeying laws like how people are making decisions, also means that you have to obey laws like the physical distribution of electricity. So all of these are examples of connections, and I think in each of them, there is some sort of endogenous decision. Now, as I said, within the electric power network, those decisions might be about where are we going to put transmission lines, or what generators are going to be on, or what loads, what demands are going to be reduced because of a response to prices. So within each of these, we have to think about how it is that the agents, the entities who are interacting across the network, how they're making those decisions, and what is motivating them, and trying to understand from the observations that we can make what is driving the types of decisions that people are making about, let's say, how much electricity they're consuming or how much electricity they might be producing, or how they're connecting consumers and producers in different places of the world, how they're making all of those decisions in combination, and how that produces the overall effect of the network. You can think of all these as resulting from some kind of action, like as I was saying. In the social network, you might be reaching out to people to become friends with them. In the biological network, the action is actual chemical reaction. In those physical networks like the electric power network, as I said, it's production and consumption. And what we can do is we can see the pattern of those actions, and that pattern of actions reveals something about the structure of the network, but also about how the network is constructed. It reveals the motivation when we see different patterns of connections being made in different places. And in order to understand the way the network is constructed, we can use those observations to then identify what is driving the decision. That's often called in our field inverse optimization, that we're seeing the result of each of the different agents, let's say producers and consumers, making decisions, and from those decisions, or from those observations of those decisions, we can infer what it was that they were trying to do. And then we can start to do types of counterfactuals in which we can say, well, what happens if we change some of the conditions? If we change some of the conditions of the network, how are those changes going to impact the overall structure of the network and the function of the network, the actual operations that we can observe on it? Okay, now I'm going to give you a little bit of some empirical observations on this. And I'm going to start off, this is work with Jing Wu that we did some time ago. And we were trying to understand the effect of position of a firm within the overall supply chain network and how that affects the value of the firm. Okay, so the value of the firm is measured, let's say, by the share price. Okay, so a little bit in terms of how we might capture what the share price is. The share price is, or should be effectively, the present value of all the future returns from that firm, all the future dividends, say, that flow to the owners of the firm. So if I look at those dividends in future time periods, let's say in time period S here, and I discount it back where the discount is given here by this exponent, where that discount includes, let's say, a risk-free discount factor, which might be something like what would be the value of US Treasury bills at the same time period with the same time payment, and some kind of risk factor. So the value of the firm is the present value of all this flow of dividends in future time periods. So then the way the network might affect what the value of that firm is either through what those expected dividends are, or it's through this risk premium factor. It's how much do I have to compensate someone for taking on risk associated with that dividend in that future time period. So that there are two effects in the network. One is, how does it affect the overall expected dividend? And the other part is, how does it affect the overall risk premium? So the dividend may depend on that expected part of the dividend. That may depend on whether your partners are able to produce or whether your partners are able to buy from you. So how much you receive in terms of a dividend depends, let's say, on supply chain partners, and it could depend on multiple levels of supply chain partners. But it's an impact directly in terms of the dividend. So I'm going to, because it's impact directly in terms of dividend, I'll call that first order, even if it happens from supply chain partners that might be 2 or 3 tiers removed from, let's say, the focal firm, the firm that we're interested in finding the value of. Within this, what we might see that people are not always attentive. They might not be paying attention to what's happening with these expected dividends. So there might be some delay, but overall, it should reflect, the value should reflect something about the expectations of these dividends in future time periods. The value should also reflect something about the risk premium. Now this risk premium depends on where a firm is in terms of its exposure to the overall risk of shocks in the network. These are shocks that you can't avoid. We call them systematic shocks because you can't avoid them. It's some sort of systematic risk. It's risk that's associated with the system overall, something that you can't diversify away from. So that risk premium depends on how the firm is connected to other firms in the network that then make it exposed to overall risk to the network, as, for example, we might have seen during the COVID period that affected much of the globe. And now this risk premium effect, it's related to the structure of the network overall. So as firms make different decisions about their relationships, that can affect the value of this risk premium factor. So that's related perhaps to how the firm is structured overall. And I'll give you a sort of stylized model to try to explain what these relationships might be, but let's first look at what we might observe in the data. Well, there have been a number of studies that have looked at this. The ones that I've highlighted here are, let's say, perhaps the most relevant for my discussion today. One is by Hendricks and Singal. Now they were looking at very specific events. This is an empirical study. And what they found is that disruptions to a supplier had long-lasting effects for that supplier's customer in terms of the overall value of the firm. So their work was primarily about what's the effect of the expectation on dividends. So that's this D part here. So their observation was that a disruption to a supplier has a long-lasting effect on that supplier's customer, such that that disruption to that supplier is going to affect its customer's value for multiple periods, in fact, multiple years after that initial disruption. So on average, suppliers are actually very important in terms of the overall value of the firm, in terms of those overall expectations. There's a similar paper here by Cohen and Frazzini, which looks at, well, it has sort of similar implications. It looked at the impact of, let's say, customers on a supplier. So it was when a customer has an impact, then how does that affect the supplier? And what they found is that when customers have impacts, in other words, when they have some kind of disruption, some kind of a effect to their overall ability to make profits, when they're affected, that is going to affect their suppliers. However, there is this delay. So they found that there was a delay in that overall effect, but they definitely documented that there was an effect from customers to suppliers. So you could think of the Hendricks signal as showing an effect from suppliers to customers, Cohen and Frazzini showing an effect from suppliers to customers, but it was delayed, that it took some time in general for the market to recognize that effect and to have it actually move from the customer to the supplier. There have also been studies of second order effects, mostly on the theoretical side. And this paper by Ajmalu and others is one that focuses on a theoretical model of how risk is propagated through the overall network of firms. And what that paper shows is that it's possible that you have idiosyncratic shocks, say in one part of the world or in one industry within the world. But those idiosyncratic shocks are then transmitted and could be amplified as they move through to other parts of the world or other parts of, or other industries within the world. So they showed that idiosyncratic shocks actually can be transmitted and become systematic shocks. So things that might happen in just one isolated part of the world, because of all these network connections, could then have impacts throughout the world. And so we always have exposure to the overall risk of the entire network. And that says that there is some sort of exposure to that systematic risk, no matter where you are within the network. And what we'd like to understand is, well, depending on where you are in the network, how much are you exposed to that overall systematic risk relative to if you were in a different place in the network? Okay. Right, so here's an example that came in this Cohen and Frazzini paper that I mentioned. So the example here was that Callaway, which makes golf clubs. So if you're a golfer, you know Callaway. Callaway first announced that it was going to miss its earnings forecast. It was going to miss its earnings forecast by a half. Okay, so it was, instead of 70 cents, it was going to be 36 cents. Immediately, the market reacted, as markets tend to do. When firms say they're going to miss their forecast, that's changing that expectation of those dividends. So it's saying those dividends, actually, at least for the next quarter, have gone down by 50% in terms of expectation relative to what they were before. So Callaway's price reacts to that. Callaway's price goes down by 30%. Coastcast, on the other hand, is a firm which makes the shafts for the Callaway golf clubs. In fact, 50% of Coastcast sales were to Callaway. So Callaway represented 50% of all the sales of this firm, Coastcast, which makes the shafts for the clubs. At first, Coastcast, even though 50% of their sales are to Callaway, and Callaway's just reported that its earnings are going down by 50%, Coastcast shares did not change at all. In fact, they remain relatively constant for about a month, and then they start to drop. And these are Coast-Cast shares, and the price are normalized here to 1. This is Coast-Cast and Callaway, and then Callaway drops. Coast-Cast remains up here, and then eventually Coast-Cast shares decline to the same level as Callaway's. So this was an example that, yes, Callaway's expectations were changed in terms of those dividends. Coast-Cast, who was a supplier of Callaway, their expectations were changed to be the same, essentially, as Callaway's, but it took the market some time to realize this. So there was some delay in terms of the market, in terms of observing that. Now, from some work that Jing and I have done, what we found is that that delay no longer seems to be apparent. That is, investors are much more attentive to whether customers have had disruptions. It's still a little unclear whether they're attentive to customers of suppliers who have disruptions. This was a supplier who had a disruption at a customer. But at least at this time, there was some delay in terms of this information being disseminated through the marketplace. But definitely it indicated that there was this effect of the network, at least at the first level of connection. This is a little bit of an example. Many of you have probably seen this example before in terms of the fire that occurred at the Philips Electronics plant when Philips was a key supplier to both Nokia and Ericsson, who made cell phones. The Philips plant announced that it was going to shut down. It revised that shutdown. And then there were 2 different ways in which their customers reacted to that disruption. Nokia, which had already contracted for additional supply, was able to react very quickly and able to restore their supply chain quite quickly. However, Ericsson, which was totally reliant on Philips and totally reliant on the production from that particular Philips factory, was not able to react. So we saw in this case, it's not as obvious in the graph here as in the previous graph that I showed, but we saw in this, again, a reaction immediately in terms of Philips dropping price. This is Philips here, dropping price. There is not so clear a reaction, but eventually we have a reaction from Ericsson. Ericsson does go down. It goes down about the same as what Philips had, whereas Nokia in this case did not go down. So this says there was a reaction from a customer having, or from a supplier having a disruption to the customer. The customer's reaction, however, depended on how that customer had constructed their supply chain. In the Nokia case, because Nokia had, in fact, multiple suppliers, Nokia was able to avoid significant disruption. Their share price essentially remained the same. Ericsson, because they were single sourcing, they were exposed to more risk. And because of being exposed to more risk, they were not able to improve their situation relative to the disruption with Philips, and their price went down. I've done this other work with Jing Shanai and Vlad Babic in terms of looking at how this is transmitted through credit default swaps. These are essentially instruments that pay off or that provide insurance for a firm in paying off its debts. So if a firm defaults on its debt, then these instruments pay off. We see the same type of pattern in terms of how these risks are transmitted through a supply chain network for these credit default swaps as we do for the price of shares. This is an example where I have the credit default swaps for 3 different companies. I have Ford, I have American Axle, which is a supplier of Ford, and AMD, Advanced Micro Devices, which is not a significant supplier of Ford, but a supplier of many other companies. And what you see there is that we have a disruption for Ford, that is Ford's credit default swaps going up significantly at this time in 2008. So Ford's credit default swap values go up. That is, that Ford gets riskier. American Axle, who is a supplier of Ford, they also appear to become riskier. Their credit default swaps go up at the same time. There's no delay in this case. And it seems like in this CDS market, these happen very quickly. The reactions happen very quickly. However, AMD in this case, not being a significant supplier of the automotive industry, basically is unaffected. So what it appears is that a shock to a customer leads to a shock to a supplier, but for non-significant suppliers, there's no impact. Okay, so that's a little bit of this empirical observation. Now let me try to put this into a model and give you some implications from that. So let's just suppose an economy where we have 2 regions, A and B, and let's say there's either a good state of the world in the future, or a good state for both A and B, or a state in the world in which A can produce, or A cannot produce and B can, or a state of the world in which B cannot produce and A can. And now I'm going to suppose that there are 4 different firms. So 1, 2, and 3 are manufacturers. Firm 1 only gets supply from region A, and firm 2 only gets supply from region B, and firm 3 gets supply from both regions A and B. And now let's say firm 4 is a distributor, and it distributes to both A and B. And now we have payoffs in different states of the world for the different firms. And what I want to do is there are 3 states of the world. So this is for firm 1. In state of the world 1, it's 1. In state of the world 2, it's 0. In state of the world 3, it's 3, and so on for each of the 4 different firms. So now, given that this is the situation here, and let's assume that each of these states of the world is equally likely. What we can do is see, well, what's the value of the firms given the structure that we've described here of this economy? Okay, so what we can do is to talk about what's the covariance between the returns, or between the value of what these firms are going to have in the future. And then we can think about an investor who invests in these firms and then tries, let's say, to minimize the variance, given that these are the covariances between the payoffs of the different firms, that tries to minimize the variance, making sure that they get a fixed return and that they use up all their wealth. And if we do that, what we end up with is that the value of firm 3, that was the value of the firm which, the manufacturing firm, which is sourcing from both of the regions, is the lowest. The value of the 2 firms that source from just one of the regions is in between, And the value of the distributor, which sources from the two regions, or which is supplying to both the two regions, that is actually the highest. Now, this is actually about their risk. It says the risk of firm 3, which has two sources, that's kind of like Nokia. That's the risk of a firm that has sources, let's say, in two different markets, kind of hedging. Because they have less exposure to risk, that means that the expected value of that firm is actually lower. The risk that firm is undergoing is less than the rest of the other firms. The firms that are connected to one in terms of manufacturing, they have somewhere in between in terms of risk. And then this firm, which is a distributor and connects to both regions, actually has the greatest risk. And that means it has this overall value is the greatest, or overall expected return is the greatest. So it says that depending on where a firm is in the supply chain, whether it's manufacturing or distribution, whether it's upstream or downstream, may have an effect on what the exposure of that firm has to the overall risk of the supply chain. And that firms that have, let's say, more hedging, maybe are less exposed to risk, but at least if they're manufacturing. But firms maybe that have more exposure, if they're further downstream, actually could be exposing themselves to more risk. So depending on where you are in the supply chain, more connections could either decrease your risk like this firm, or they might increase your risk like this firm. So the upstream firms might be decreasing their risk, and downstream firms might be increasing their risk as they make more connections. In fact, we can show that. We can extend this to multiple sectors. And we can show that depending on the number of connections for firms between, let's say, one industrial sector and another industrial sector, if they have more of these connections, in other words, if we have a denser network than this sparse network over here, then we're going to be able to get more production out of these firms that have this denser network. And in particular for concave production functions, the firms over here that have this denser network are going to be able to produce more. They're going to be worth more, and each of them is going to be exposed to less risk. So we'll have less risk over here for these firms that are in this dense network, or less risk means they'll be able to produce more than the firms that are over here in this sparse network. In fact, that's what we effectively saw during this Great Recession or financial crisis in the 2008-2009 period. I have here a graph of the firms before the crisis and a graph of the firms after. And I've colored here in red, these are the firms that are central in the economy. And you can see before the crisis, they're sort of spread out. That is, there's lots of connections between firms. There are more firms, but many connections between firms. So that contrasts to what happened after the crisis. After the crisis, you see the centralized firms now are tightly knit. They're pulled together. The graph over here is actually much sparser. It's more tightly connected than the graph over here, the overall impact of that meant not only was there destruction of firms during this financial crisis period, not only are there fewer firms, but there are fewer connections. The fact that there are fewer connections means there's more risk. So there's this double impact. There's the impact of expectations have gone down in terms of being able to produce, because now I'm not able to produce as much. And risk has gone up. And because risk has gone up, I'm also not able to produce as much. So the value is going down even more. So we have both the impact of changing these expectations as well as increasing overall risk. All right, now I'll try to go through the last part here, another little stylized example, but in terms of cascades. So you might think, let's suppose that there are firms that are all just buying and selling to each other. And so D and C are supplying to A, and A is supplying to B, B is supplying to D, and so on. And they'll say there's some outside forces here. Well, if everything at the beginning, let's say, is perfectly balanced, but then there's a disruption, something happens to D. D loses some of its input. So it needs to get input of 10 in order to supply A and C. If it's not able to do that, well, then D might default. D might not be able to produce for A and B. That in turn means that C is not going to be able to produce for A. Maybe A is not going to be able to produce for B, and that there might be this cycle of a cascade, that D defaults, then C, then A, then B. And that might bring all of them down. So we might have this effect of a single disruption then gets propagated through the entire chain. I'll talk a little bit about a model for this from Elliott, Golub, and Jackson, where we have organizations, entities here, you could think of these as owners, that have holdings in different companies. And then there's something of a fundamental value for what that company is. And we see what's the total value of the overall company, which depends on the fundamental value plus how much you hold of the other firms. Now that overall value of each of the firms in this network is then composed of this fundamental value plus these cross holdings, or we can solve for it by then taking this cross holding matrix, putting it on the other side and taking the inverse. But now we'll suppose again that there's some sort of disruption. So one of, let's say, these values slips below and it goes down below a certain level. And if it drops by that level, then it's forced to do something different, like sell off some of its assets and take a loss. And so its value drops precipitously. Its value drops by a fixed amount here, B. So as those losses occur, they can accumulate. So one firm now has lost something. It has an implication for what the other firms do. There's some implications in terms of how these firms are connected to one another. Sometimes if they have more connections, it might make the overall network more stable. If they have even more connections, then we'll start to get that effect that I showed before, whereas you make more connections, your value might actually go down. And in terms of how much they depend on their partners, we might see other kinds of effects as well. What we should do, though, is as we're looking at how these firms are adjusting to these connections, we should think about how are they going to change their investments in the other firms. So we should think about how they're going to make decisions on what are the other firms are going to connect to and what's going to be the impact of those decisions. So the way we can look at that is to say, well, we can think of each of these firms as solving some kind of an overall portfolio optimization problem. Like they're trying to decide, well, I want to maximize the value of the company. To maximize the value of the company, I want to maximize the expectations, again, maximize the expected value of those dividends. But I'd also don't want to expose the firm to too much risk. So I want to do that in such a way that I minimize risk at the same time, so I can have some kind of mean variance type of objective. And let's just assume that that's what firms do, so that they solve something like they maximize expected value minus some component associated with risk. And they create an optimal portfolio. And now, based on how they're making those connections and assuming that they're making these connections according to this optimal portfolio, we can decide how they value those connections and therefore how they are making those decisions about what other firms to connect to. And then we can do, once we have those values, we can do some counterfactuals. I'm going to apply this to some banking data. So let me look at country cross-holdings. So I'm going to think of the banks in each country as like the firm, and they're holding, let's say, assets of banks in other countries. And these are the actual cross-holdings. So this is how much do firms in France hold of companies in Germany, or firms in France hold of companies in Greece, or Germany and holding in France, and so on. So I picked out some European countries as well as Japan and the US, and put in all their cross holdings into this matrix. What I'm going to do is to look at what happens when I have a cascade, but I allow firms to change the amount that they hold of these other countries' assets as they react to, let's say, defaults within one country versus another. And I'm going to look at how the defaults cascade as firms make these adjustments. And I'll sort of stress the network more and more. So I'll put more stress in the network and see what happens as to the defaults as I put more stress in the network. This is just some of the data for the network. And some of the things that we can infer from what their cross holdings are. Okay, so now this would be if I take the network as given with all the banks, let's say in these countries, having no restrictions on their capital, no restriction on how much capital that they need to hold. And then I'll start to stress the overall network. And as I stress it, you'll see what happens to where things are defaulting first. So this would sort of follow progression that you might expect. First, Greece defaults. Then as I stress it more, Portugal. Then as I stress it more, it goes Portugal, and then Italy, and then Spain, and then France, and then Japan, and then Germany, and then the UK, and then the US. So as I stress it more and more, I get defaults in these different countries according to the process that you might think of. Now, a way to address this might be, oh, well, let's make sure that these firms hold more capital. So if I force countries to force their banks to hold more capital, how is that going to affect what these cascades are? And if I force everyone, let's say, to hold 6% in this capital, a 6% capital requirement, which actually would stress Europe, well, we get a little bit of a difference. We have first Greece, no longer Portugal, goes Greece and then Italy. And then as I stress it more, not Portugal, but Germany. So Germany actually defaults faster. And what happened? as the capital requirement went up, German banks actually changed their investment. If I look at how they would change their investment, they would actually be taking on more risk. And by looking at how they're reacting to that effect of the change in their capital requirement and the risks that they take with their investments, we get a very different picture of how these defaults would cascade. It would go Germany and then Japan, and then finally Portugal, and then Spain, France, UK, and US. If I push the capital requirement up even more, instead of Greece, now it's Italy that defaults first, and then Germany, and then Greece, and then so on through these others. Okay, so we can look at other kinds of relationships in this way. There are many places in which we get to see something about networks, but we don't know exactly how people are forming these networks. That's an opportunity to use this idea of inverse optimization to say, well, I see what solutions they've come up with. Based on the solutions that they've come up with, I can infer something about what they were trying to do, and then I can start to do counterfactuals. And I can do it in a dynamic way. I can look at when firms come into markets, when they go out, when they make connections to new regions in the globe, when they make connections to new industries. It can give me information about how to design networks. There are many applications that we can see in this as well. So in conclusion, I gave you some observations about behavior and networks, and the fact that we don't often see exactly what the network is. Even in those, with the supply chain studies that I showed you, it doesn't tell me everything about the network. It's only things that are, let's say, revealed in public sources, or some of it's regulatory in the US. Sometimes it's just because people announce large contracts. Much of that information is hidden. However, we can use this ability to take our observations and then from the observations infer something about the network structure and use that to look at different kinds of counterfactuals. And that allows us to look at different kinds of dynamic behavior, different kinds of policies, the effects of those policies, and to look at the overall impact on the global supply chain. So with that, thank you for your attention. And now hopefully I have some time for questions.
Yes, Professor Birge, thank you very much for the very interesting seminar. And I hope that actually for me, I learned a lot from your seminar. And so, ladies and gentlemen, so if you have any question, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A function that you may type your question for Professor Birge. And please, when you raise your question, please also tell us your affiliation and your name. Okay, so let's see. Okay. Right. Okay. So okay. So we have one question from. Okay, so it's here in the Q&A box. So thank you,
Yes.
Professor Birge, for the insightful talk. So this is Tim from Hong Kong U. Okay, so this is an exciting research direction. He wished to know more about the computational complexity. Yeah, so that aspect.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, so it depends on the structure of these problems. So for computational complexity, if we have, let's say, all concave utility functions or convex cost functions, as long as we were sort of in that convex optimization framework, then most of these problems, let's say these inverse optimization problems, can be solved polynomially, that is with algorithms that run in polynomial time. However, there are many circumstances in which those convex relationships are not going to hold. So in other words, there are many situations in which we'll have, let's say, some kind of fixed cost or some kind of decreasing marginal cost, in which case let's say, returns to scale, or increase in returns to scale. In which case, then, yes, then we may have to use other kinds of algorithms, in which case, that's an interesting question about the complexity of actually being able to solve those problems. My intuition is that if you have maybe some very specific structure, you may be able to come up with some polynomial algorithms. But in general, those problems are probably going to be hard in terms of computational complexity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Birge. To me, I also have some question. So I wish you know, I think now currently we have this COVID-19 pandemic, right? Then I think, of course, so your research, I think this is extremely useful. Then we understand how the risk is propagated along the supply chain network. So do you have some preliminary or some research or some findings regarding COVID-19, how it impacts on the supply chain network?
Yeah, I do. I have a paper with Jingwu Shinayacha and one of Jing's students, Yang Zhang. In that paper, we look at what happened during the COVID period and the differential reaction as China opened up relative to the rest of the world. And what we found is that we again use these credit default swaps. So what we found is that initially, if let's say you were a US producer and you had Chinese suppliers or Chinese customers, additionally, initially, let's say in that period of February 2020, your perception of risk actually went up. In other words, your credit default swap values went higher if you had this exposure to Chinese firms up until the end of March. However, the end of March, when China started to open up, there was the reverse effect. So that if you had exposure to Chinese suppliers and customers and you were a US firm, then you actually did better in that period than if you didn't have Chinese suppliers and customers. So what we saw was a direct impact of first China limiting production and its influence on firms across the world, that they became riskier. However, then once China started to open up, then these other firms actually became less risky relative to their peers. So we saw a direct impact of this. The other thing within that is that there was some mitigation depending on where you had other suppliers. And So if you had, let's say, alternative suppliers from different part of Asia, or let's say from Europe, that was mitigating. But mitigating both ways. In other words, you weren't as affected by China's closure at the beginning, but then you also didn't benefit as much when China started to recover.
Yes, thank you, Professor Birge. So we receive more questions. So one question in the Q&A box is, so how can this network be applied to a global remanufacturing supply chain?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I think in the remanufacturing and how products re-enter, I think what remanufacturing does is it's probably part of this impact of extending the overall supply chain. And what that can do then is to make a firm actually be, you may think you're a downstream firm, but you're also an upstream firm because of the remanufacturing. So you may have both effects. That is, you may have the effect of being downstream, but you may also have an effect of being upstream. The overall impact, I think, should be that it makes the overall supply chain more resilient. But that's an interesting empirical question. Do those effects cancel out to some extent? That is, the fact that you're both a downstream as well as maybe an upstream firm because of the remanufacturing. I think that's an interesting empirical question, let's say, to consider.
Thank you, Professor Birge. So we have more questions coming. Okay, so one question available on the chat box and also the Q&A box is from Yuxiang Chang from University of Chinese Academy of Science, China. So his research is supply chain finance. The supply chain network's risk is also will be impacted when some of the firms suffer from short financing distress. Supply chain finance is also a hot topic. So he reviews a lot of papers, okay? Your papers with Professor Alex Yang. Would you give some ideas about how to combine the supply chain finance with the networks and some thinking for supply chain finance development in the future potential research areas?
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. Yeah. So I focus on more of the let's say the physical interaction, physical trade of products, but obviously supply chain finance is an important part as well. I think that's a particularly critical part in let's say developing markets where supply chain finance is, well, it's not ubiquitous, and often you have to go through different parties in order to secure financing. Certainly the role of risk and how that affects the financing decisions that firms make, I think that's a critical part of these decisions. So if I think about making those connections, I'm not making connections just because of, let's say, hedging production risk. I'm making connections also because I want to hedge in terms of financing risk. I don't want to connect to places where, let's say, I have a risky customer in terms of their payments, and I may want to connect with suppliers where I can get greater financing terms. So that the impact of the terms as well as the decision on those connections, I think is sort of critically important. And it sort of brings a multi-dimensional aspect to the supply chain decisions. It's not just about the production decisions, but about the financing decisions at the same time. So there's definitely a lot of possibilities, I think, to explore that both theoretically and empirically in these.
Yeah.
Let's see. So what's our next?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Birge. Yeah. So the next question I think is relevant to propagation in OR. So would that be okay?
Okay,
I
sure,
find
sure.
it okay. So from Hao from Southeast University. So he has a problem about publishing research results in OR as a top journal in operations management. Okay, I wonder what's the difference of studies focusing on machine learning approach between OR and some other top journals or conference in the field of computer science or IEEE journals.
Okay, so so for machine learning, I guess it depends on the type of paper. So if it's a paper where you are focused more on like a method, like an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, then that would probably be the machine learning and data science area, in which case it would be very similar, I would say, to something like Journal of Machine Learning Research for OR, where we would want something about, let's say, the performance of the algorithm, some results about that. Mostly, I would say, it's kind of focused on, let's say, the complexity of the algorithm or the range of problems that the algorithm might be able to solve, but it'd be the characteristics of the algorithm. Now that's one type of paper, and that'll probably be in the machine learning and data science area. The other type of paper might be a paper where it's using machine learning to answer a question like a supply chain question. Let's say trying to find out the effect of prices on customers in different regions. In which case then it would be more similar to the papers that appear in operations and supply chain or operations and supply chain area. In which case it would be, what does the paper say about supply chains or about operational decisions in supply chains? And what kinds of new insights does it provide for operations and supply chains? So it'd be for operations and supply chains overall. So I sort of see there are two different types of machine learning papers, and both of those, I think, we would have in OR, where the latter would be less likely to appear in computer science or IEEE.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Birge. So we have one more question from Zhang Zhongfei, a doctoral student from Jinan University. So thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. Regarding the collaborative decision-making analysis method for complex supply chain systems, what do you think about some promising methods? In addition, in order to better understand the research of supply chain optimization configuration, what unsolved problems can we pay more attention to?
Yeah, so I think this overall question about how firms choose their supply chain partners and how they make decisions about, let's say, having multiple sources versus single sources, where those sources are. In other words, how does the risk of those sources affect the decisions that they make? How does, let's say, the reliability of those sources affect the decisions that they make? And how does that combine in an overall supply chain? So like the overall equilibrium of the network. So with each of these firms making individual decisions about what their suppliers are, what their customers are, how does that get translated into the overall network that we see? I think those are questions which I don't think we fully understand. We know a lot about how firms make, let's say, individual decisions once they have a supplier, or within many papers looking at sort of stylized models of that. But how does that relate to what we actually observe in the global supply chain network? And how does that lead to the structures that we see in the global supply chain network? I think those are interesting questions, which I don't think have been fully addressed, and their relationship to the financing, which I think is a critical part of those decisions as well. I think those are all important issues for people to consider.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Birge, for the very insightful, very interesting talk. And then, so we all learn a lot, and then I'm sure there will be a lot of research, future research in supply chain network and then the risk propagations. So to close the section, may I now invite our Director of Research and also the coordinator of this seminar series, Dr. Ray Zhong, to give a closing speech.
Okay, thank you so much, YH and my colleagues. And thank you very much, Professor Birge, for the great support and a wonderful talk. On behalf of the Department of Research Committee, as Professor Max Shen talked about, the physical invitation, from Professor Birge to our department after the pandemic. We are very, very happy and to be honored to invite you. As a promise from our department, whenever should your traveling plan, please feel free to let me know. And thank you for your great support to the department, the university, and also the insights from your talk. And I think as a young researcher in this area, we have learned a lot, and your guidance to our research directions and the patience to answering these questions are very much appreciated. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. And in the coming 2 weeks later, we are very happy invite Professor Ming Hu, who is the editor-in-chief from Labor Research Logistics. So we are very much looking forward to your participate in the near future, invited seminars. And thank you so much again, Professor Birge. Please take